Welcome to this Arnold Arboretum tree mob, Leaving Off with Leaves. I'm your host, Pam Thompson, Manager of Adult Education. And for anyone who is joining us from afar or for the first time, the Arnold Arboretum is a public park designed by Frederick Law Olmsted and a world-class research collection of temperate trees, shrubs, and vines for all to learn from and enjoy. The Arnold Arboretum is located in Boston, Massachusetts. Our speaker today is Ryan Devlin, Arnold Arboretum Horticultural Technologist. Ryan's interest in horticulture began in high school with a job on an organic vegetable farm with the Food Project in Lincoln, Mass. He went on to complete a bachelor's degree in agricultural sciences at Cornell University. An apprenticeship at Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge led to a permanent position there, and now, as an Arnold Arboretum horticulturist, Ryan cares for several areas of the Arboretum, including the hickories, magnolias, and tillias. Ryan will speak, and then we will answer questions that you can submit through the Q&A feature. Please welcome Ryan Devlin.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining today. So yes, as Pam just said, my name's Ryan Devlin. I'm a horticulture technologist at the Arboretum. And I'm joining you live today from the Arboretum where it's quite snowy and we've been doing a lot of snow removal. And we'll continue to do that for the remainder of today and probably all tomorrow. But the focus for now is talking about leaves and leaf management at the Arboretum. So I have two goals in the presentation for today that I would like to focus on. One, I would love to address some misconceptions about leaves and leaf fall in the landscape. And two, I'd like to offer some practical tips for managing leaves in your own landscape based on practices that we do at the Arboretum here. So the agenda for the about 20-minute presentation, we'll start with just talking about deciduous leaf fall. Why does it happen each autumn and what are kind of the mechanics of it? We're gonna look at the value of leaves in the landscape and as a component in compost. We'll then discuss some potential issues with fallen leaves, discuss leaves in lawns, and then we'll do an overview of the Arboretum leaf management strategies, and we'll finish with looking at how you can apply some of those strategies in your own landscape. So why does leaf drop happen? I think contrary to what a lot of people think, leaf drop is actually quite an active process, not a passive process. And it's something that's evolved for a particular set of reasons. One of which is we live in temperate climates, like in the Northeast, the winters are quite harsh. And dropping leaves is actually a way for the tree to protect itself. Deciduous leaves are thin and they're susceptible to rupturing from cell freezing. So if they continued to be on the tree and consistent below freezing temperatures, they wouldn't be in such good shape. Also, when you look at deciduous trees, they have quite a big surface area, which is quite advantageous during the summer season and the spring for photosynthesis and maximizing photosynthesis, making food for the plant. But during the winter, that big surface area on the leaf is actually quite good at collecting snow, collecting ice. It picks up a lot of sail during windstorms. All these things can lead to breakage during big storms in the winter, which is not advantageous for the survival of the plant. We saw this past October with kind of a rare snowstorm that we had, and we had quite a bit of damage in our small trees and shrubs, a lot of branches breaking, and that was because the leaves had not fallen from a lot of our trees and shrubs at that point. So that's kind of what happens when we have those rare snowstorms early in the season. And then finally, dropping the leaves is an opportunity for the trees to kind of start anew each spring. Over the course of a season, a lot of damage can take place, which is not necessarily an unusual thing. It can take place from different types of diseases and pests. And starting anew each spring with a new set of leaves gives the tree to kind of maximize its photosynthesis with full healthy leaves. So what are the mechanics of leaf drop in simple form? So leaf drop kind of for deciduous trees begins in the fall as the day length gets shorter and temperatures begin to drop. The tree has a hormonal response to those two kind of indications with weather and day length. And it's a highly controlled process with that response that the tree has. And as the day length goes down and as temperatures drop, photosynthesis slows and water transpiration from the tree to the leaf also slows. And part of the reason for this is in cold weather and in shorter day lengths, photosynthesis is not particularly efficient. So the tree is beginning to slow it down and grind it to a halt. While this is happening, a wall of cells is formed between the twig and the leaf stem, and we call that the abscission layer. And as that layer is being formed, the vascular system between the leaf and the tree is being cut off. And when the abscission layer is fully formed, the leaf falls. It's also worth noting that many conifers, cone-bearing trees, while we think of them as not having that fall needle drop, they do in fact drop some of their, many of conifers drop some of their needles in the fall. So for example, pines, which are one of the more significant types of trees that drop their needles in the fall, when a pine tree makes new needles, those needles will last about 3 or 4 years and then they'll drop. So each fall, pine needles are losing a smaller percentage, certainly not all of their needles, but a small percentage of their needles will fall each autumn. So what is the value of leaves in the landscape? And it's quite numerous, actually. One of the #1 values of leaves fallen in place in the landscape is they provide excellent cover and habitat for insects and other animals. Butterflies and moths rely, many butterflies and moths rely very much so on having that protective cover that leaves provide in the landscape on the ground. This enables the butterflies and moths of whatever form they're in the winter to have kind of a protective layer from the cold and harsh conditions of temperate climate winters. Leaves also provide an amazing and necessary source of organic matter, and just an overall great addition to the health of the soil. They provide a wonderful layer of carbon-rich soil over time as they break down. In addition, leaves when they're on top of the soil, they protect the soil from compaction, especially in urban landscapes with people walking around, things like that, as well as runoff. They help slow the flow of water over top of the soil, and that helps to reduce erosion in soils. Leaves can also inhibit weed seed germination. Now, this can be a short-term thing because leaves will break down over time, but they can be an important source of inhibiting weed seed germination in the landscape by blocking sunlight and some water from reaching underneath where seeds would germinate in the soil. And finally, it's worth noting that to get a lot of the ecological value of leaves, when we think about how they benefit the habitat and provide a protective cover for insects and animals, it's best to leave them whole. So that's one thing to consider going forward with your leaf management. So another great resource that leaves provide is an excellent ingredient in compost. So here at the Arboretum, we use what leaves we collect in our compost operation, and leaves provide an excellent source of brown material, of carbon-rich material in a compost, which usually is a mix of carbon-rich material that are brown, dry things like leaves, and nitrogen-rich material, which are often green, fresh things like vegetable scraps, grass, clippings. Leaves can also be composted just by themselves, and that also creates a great organic material. We refer to that as leaf mold. The difference between leaf mold and compost is leaf mold is actually a much slower, cooler process than compost. It's driven by fungal decay rather than a bacterial decomposition process that takes place with compost. It still results in a great product that can be used in the landscape. So it's worth noting, while leaves are such an excellent resource in our landscapes, there are times when leaves go bad. And here's a few examples. So as the picture shows, in our urban areas and where we have hardscape and things like that, it's important that the water can flow and collect in drains, especially as we see higher frequency of large rain events, excuse me. And leaves can clog those drains, so it's really important to clear leaves off drains in the fall and make sure drains are clear for the winter months and spring and so forth. Leaves also can make hardscapes like roads, paths quite slippery. So it's important to clear them off in spaces like that for safety reasons. Another aspect that can come up from time to time, and it's important to observe things like this, is leaves can create cover for voles, which can be quite damaging to the landscape in terms of making holes in the ground, chewing on roots and the bases of plants. So it's just something to look out for. It's not necessarily a reason not to keep your leaves, but it's something to make sure you're continually observing to see if there's vole activity. And if there is, it might be worth thinking about how to change your leaf cover. Finally, leaves can carry diseases and pests, especially over the winter. Sometimes diseases and pests can live on or underneath the leaves and survive into the spring. So if you have a particularly bad and serious disease outbreak in a tree over the season, it's worth thinking about whether or not to remove those leaves from the site if you're worried about them overwintering in the landscape and being a problem again in the spring. And additionally, leaves can build up around the bases of plants, which over time, if not checked, can cover where the root flare meets the stem of the plants, which can lead to rot. Not a big concern, but just something to monitor and kind of brush leaves from around the bases of plants if you see that happening. So this slide I called the leaf lawn paradox, and I think this is kind of a really important point because I think the biggest misconception with leaves in our society relates to their impact on lawns. So yes, it is true that if left whole in large amounts, leaves can smother turf and cause snow mold diseases. A lot of the turf grasses that we have on our lawns, which of course is a very popular way to landscape people's yards and houses, are cool season grasses, which in the fall do a lot of their growing and root production and so forth. And if leaves are on top of them and creating a cover, blocking out sunlight, holding down moisture, that can lead to turf snow mold diseases, as well as just turf dying off because of lack of sunlight and rotting. So that is a concern. That being said, leaves can actually be a huge resource for your lawns and making them healthy. And the way to do that is mulching them. So if leaves are properly mulched, and by mulched I mean shredded, and there's various ways to do that, and we'll go over that, that can provide many benefits to your lawn. It can act as a fertilizer, providing an excellent source of organic matter, and it helps to cover bare spots on your lawn that are a great spot for weed seed germination otherwise. And one thing I'll just mention quickly there, I guess there was a study that came out of Michigan State University that looked at dandelion germination, and over time they saw that leaf mulch cover on lawns, if mulched properly, could prevent some weed seed germination in dandelions. So there is some studies that confirm that. So arboretum leaf management. I think in thinking about it, there's two ways that I could sum that up in terms of our methodology, our thought process, our principles at the Arboretum. And one is that leaves are a gift, not a nuisance. At the Arboretum, we consider the leaves a wonderful resource in the landscape, and we follow through with our practices with that in mind. And two, tailored management to desired goals is best. So we look at different parts of our landscape and we think about what are our goals, and we follow through with a leaf management practice that works for those goals. So here's some statistics about leaf management at the Arboretum that one of my coworkers calculated, and leaves are only collected from 7% of the Arboretum. By collected, I'm referring to, we blow the leaves into piles and we collect them with our leaf vacuum, which sucks them up into a dump truck, and then we go and dump that dump truck in our composting operation on site. The other 93% of the Arboretum has leaves just mulched or left in place. And as I mentioned, collected leaves are brought to the compost pile. So what that means is 100% of the leaves at the Arboretum are kept at the Arboretum. They're not put into our mainstream waste system. They are kept at the Arboretum as a wonderful resource for us to use. So what equipment do we use at the Arboretum? Of course, we use hand tools like everyone else. One of our pieces of equipment that we rely on the most, however, is mowers. Our landscape team here uses commercial ride-on mowers, and they go through a large amount of landscape mulching leaves with the mowers. And because a lot of our landscape has some degree of turf, that's an important task in terms of keeping the turf healthy. We also use walk-behind mowers in mulched areas, plant beds, areas where the larger mowers won't fit. That's another important aspect of our operation. And we use blowers to help guide leaves in directions that we want them to go. And of course, the leaf vacuum, that's a picture of it there, with the leaf box, which is the attachment on the back of our dump truck that collects the leaves that are sucked up by the leaf vacuum. So looking a little deeper at the methodology at the Arboretum, there's kind of 4 management styles, I guess I could say, at the Arboretum in terms of how we deal with the leaves. So when we remove leaves completely, that's generally on our hardscapes. That's roads, paths, sidewalks, gates. All those areas have leaves 100% removed for the safety of our visitors and for the maintenance of those spaces. Areas where we remove most of the leaves are highly manicured areas. These are spaces around buildings, areas where there's lots of lawn traffic, people walking on the lawn. Now, these are not a large amount of our spaces at the Arboretum, but areas that, such as in front of the Honeywell building and in the Rose Garden, areas in which we have a lot of people walking around and we want that turf to stay as healthy as possible to kind of keep up with that compaction and so forth. In areas where we do not remove leaves, that is generally our natural areas. So we have several natural areas, what we call natural areas in the Arboretum, and those are pretty similar to just kind of wood lots, basically. There's not a lot of horticulture maintenance going on in those areas, and we just let the leaves fall and we don't manage them. And finally, the vast majority of the Arboretum, we really do a combination of those techniques in which we mulch leaves, we leave them in place, we relocate them into beds or natural areas nearby. So we do kind of a combination of those techniques based on what the landscape needs. So in looking at how you can manage your own landscapes, sort of based on the management we do here at the Arboretum, there's 2 things that I think are important to consider. One is keeping leaves on site if possible. And 2 is when managing leaves in your site, leaving them in place, leaving them where they fall when possible. And if not possible, mulching or relocating the leaves close by. And I say these 2 things because if you look at the graph that is on the slide here, which the EPA put together, Environmental Protection Agency, put together this graph, which looks at how yard trimmings, which is a classification that includes leaves, grass clippings, probably small twigs. They look at how those are dealt with in the mainstream waste system. So when people put those bags of leaves, grass clippings out on the curb to be picked up by the municipality, what happens to those leaves? And you can see over time that it's actually changed quite a bit. So in the 1960s, in the graph, the gray represents leaves being landfilled, and that's it. So in the 1960s, it was basically all yard trimmings were sent to the landfill. Nowadays, in 2018 being the most recent year, a good amount, actually a majority of leaves and other yard trimmings are composted by municipalities, which is an excellent progression. That being said, all 3 of these categories, leaves being landfilled, leaves being composted, and leaves being combusted through energy recovery, they require a lot of fossil fuels to be picked up, and they're leaving your landscape. So that's a great source of organic matter and all those other benefits that we talked about, leaving your own personal landscape. So while it's great that leaves are being composted in many municipalities, and that's something that's worth checking on if you're going to bring leaves out to the curb in your own community, it's still best to leave them on your own property or landscape if you can. So what is some equipment for smaller landscapes that is useful? So probably the #1 piece of equipment that many people managing landscapes already have that is really useful for managing leaves is a basic push behind lawnmower. In the past 5 years, the majority of push behind mowers that have been made are made for mulching leaves as well as cutting grass. Now, when they say they're made for mulching, usually what that means is the mower has a high deck and it has a special mulching blade, a serrated mulching blade that is good at chopping up the leaves finely. That being said, pretty much any standard walk behind mower will work. You should look at the manual to make sure that it's a safe thing to do with the machine and follow all safety instructions in terms of personal protective equipment and so forth. The mowers are a great tool for mulching the leaves. And there's 3 ways that you can go about using a push behind mower for mulching leaves. One is you can use it with a bag that will collect the leaves as they're being mulched. This is good if you want to remove the leaves off the lawn and add them to your compost or use them as mulch in a garden bed. You can also use the walk behind mower with the side discharge open. That's a little chute on the side that can be opened up. And as the leaves are mulched, they'll be shot out to the side of the mower and distributed on the lawn. And finally, you can have the side discharge down and the bag off, and the leaves will just be mulched underneath the mower and left in place. And one great thing about that technique is it mulches the leaves very finely, and it distributes them under the lawn nicely and leaves a lot of space for the grass to come up over the leaves, if that makes sense. And one thing to be careful of, though, if you use that technique, you want to make sure you're not mulching too many leaves at one time. It's good to really mulch leaves once a week in the fall as they're falling, and that helps you keep up with them without stressing out your machine and potentially causing damage to it. And it's also, when mulching leaves through any of these techniques, you want to make sure you have the setting, the deck of the mower as high as possible. And that will allow the mower to mulch the leaves more efficiently without stressing the machine out. Now, there's also specific pieces of equipment for homeowners and people managing their own landscapes that are specifically made for leaf collecting and leaf mulching. And those are also great options. At home, I have a blower that blows leaves and also actually can be reversed and suck in leaves, and it shoots them into a bag and mulches them while it does it. So as I go, I can take the bag off. I have a bag full of mulch leaves. I can throw it in my compost. I can use it as a mulch in garden beds, etc. And finally, it's worth noting that a lot of these pieces of equipment, both blowers, lawn mowers, things like that, they can be purchased as battery powered. And it's worth looking into that option because it's a more sustainable option. Less fossil fuels are used. And there's a lot of great powerful equipment these days with battery power. And so, yeah, that's it. And I'm open for questions.
So people were wondering about the oaks, and that some oaks retain their leaves and some drop them. Any thoughts on why that is?
Oh, and why they retain their leaves?
Why some do and some don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm trying to remember if someone has talked to me about that. I don't have the answer on the top of my head as to why some oaks leave their leaves and some don't. I think that's an interesting question, as why that would be advantageous in the evolutionary process. But yeah, I'm not sure.
So can you talk a little bit about when in the fall and when in the spring it's okay to chip leaves to hasten the mulching? Is there a time when it's better to do that so you're not disrupting insects and
Great question.
other critters?
Great question. So yeah, I'm leaving the leaves as they are is the best option in terms of not disrupting habitat and cover for insects and animals. When you decide to mulch leaves, it is better to do it earlier in the fall so that they are then left in place untouched after that and throughout the winter, so that cover is not being disrupted, if that makes sense. Obviously, it's a little time dependent because you have to wait until all the leaves are finished falling, which at times can take, till the end of November for that to happen.
Have you noticed the Japanese maples seem to be hanging on to their leaves into the winter? And you probably don't know the answer to why, but
Yeah, I haven't noticed that so much in our landscape. Certainly, some Japanese maples hold their leaves longer than
yes.
other maples.
And someone was asking, did they not form their abscission layer at the right time? When will they fall, and how does that happen? Um,
Yeah, so if you see any tree species, if you consistently see um, different trees that are holding on to their leaves, all the same type of tree, that's just the species. It's not a particular issue with the tree, if that makes sense.
Here's a good one. Are leaves with black tar spot okay to remain on the ground, okay to compost at home, or best to bag up and turn into the city's compost?
So black tar spot is really not a serious disease at all. It really does not affect the health of the tree. It's more so an aesthetic issue, and so that's definitely okay to leave on site. And that's the case for a lot of diseases, unless it's a really serious tree disease that's going to seriously impact the health of some of the plants on your grounds. It's okay to leave leaves, particularly if you compost them. That can kill a lot of the different diseases if you're getting it to the right temperature, of course, which is difficult sometimes in home composting.
Okay, there's a question still related to leaves and abscission layers, but someone's speculating that where trees draw down sugars from leaves prior to abscission, did the October cold snap and heavy snow cut off a tree's ability to benefit from that end of the season process, particularly the maples, perhaps? And did that add any additional stress, do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that 100%. I do think that storm events like that can certainly quicken the falling of leaves. Whether or not that impacts, the tree's ability to take back all those sugars from the leaves, my guess would be no, but I don't have that answer 100%.
Okay. Someone's saying they don't have a lawn, but she wants to mulch her leaves in 2 parts of her yard. Can she use a chipper from Home Depot? You can buy a leaf chipper where it's got a
leaf
small.
chipper. I get you. I thought you were talking about. Yes, of course. Yeah, no, it's a great tool for mulching your leaves.
Are there types of leaves that mulch better than others? For example, I have heard that oak leaves do not break down easily, but other types do.
Yeah, that's a great question, and that definitely kind of informs our management sometimes at the Arboretum as well. So in collections, because at the Arboretum we have collections of similar species in the same area. So we have like an oak collection and a hickory collection, all kind of within the same area. In our oaks, we do a lot of leaf mulching because oak leaves don't break down that quickly. In our hickories, which the leaves break down a lot more quickly, we do less leaf mulching, and we've actually been leaving a lot of the leaves in place because they break down so quickly just on their own.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So if you have predominantly oak leaves, are they too acidic?
Yeah, so that's definitely not so much an issue, especially if you're growing native plants that are used to having oak leaves on the ground. Many oak trees are native to the Northeast. And even so, as leaves break down, and particularly in compost, that a lot of that acidity is neutralized. So if you do have concerns with that, you can compost it, and a lot of that compost leaves, a lot of that acidity will be neutralized, but I don't think it should be too much of a concern, even if you're just leaving them in place.
Okay. Can dumping raked leaves in the woods be harmful to the trees in the woods?
No, definitely not. If you go out and take a walk in the woods, you'll see there's a very large leaf layer, and it's healthy for the soils of the woods. Now, if they're invasive leaves or you're dumping leaves continually right around the base of one tree, that could potentially be harmful. But in general, that's not a bad thing.
You can move unwanted seeds into an area that way, which
True.
is
Also
something to be careful of.
Yeah, so if especially if you have a fragile ecosystem and you're dumping leaves from non-native plants or plants that have been growing near invasive plants, you want to be considerate of that. So that's another reason why it is good to leave leaves on your own site, or you can have your municipality compost them in that case too, if you're concerned about that.
Tell us more about voles and how do we know if we have voles? What are the signs of those?
Yeah, so it can be difficult sometimes with the damage itself to identify between rabbit damage, for example, and vole damage. If you're seeing, chewing at the base of your plants and the roots, and you see holes around the plants, that in combination is usually a good sign that voles are there in the landscape.
I've seen tunnels in my yard, and that I think is voles.
A very telltale sign.
What is the proper particle size of mulched leaves? Should they be fine dust, or is merely chopping them into a couple of pieces per leaf enough?
Yeah, great question. I think it kind of depends on your lawn. So that's one thing I didn't go into a ton of detail about, but when we're mulching leaves at the Arboretum, if we're mulching leaves on a lawn that is really highly manicured and is pretty much 100% cool season turf grasses, and we want to keep it that way, we want to make sure that the leaves are really finely mulched. They're not covering the grass so much. You can really still see the blades of grass through the leaves clearly. And but on the other hand, if we're mulching leaves, for example, in the oaks, which is not a conventional lawn, of course it has turf grass, but it has a lot of carex, dandelions, a mix of different plants, many of which are not bothered by the leaf cover. We don't have to mulch to the same degree, and you can have a lot thicker pile of mulched leaves, if that makes sense. So I guess it kind of depends on the degree of or the percentage of actual turf grass your lawn is. The more turf grass, the more you want to mulch, and the finer mulch size of the leaf you want.
Someone is suggesting that the severe drought we had this year was perhaps very disruptive to the trees losing their leaves or forming abscission layers, etc. So that might be one of the reasons why people are seeing some of those Japanese maples holding on to leaves.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, specifically with the Japanese maples, I'm not sure that the drought would impact the leaves being held onto, but drought certainly will result in early leaf drop in a lot of trees.
Okay, here's someone saying they work at an urban university on campus, and they would like to leave more of their leaves, but end up having challenges with leaves blowing into the walkways and maybe not looking neat enough. Wondering if we run into this at the Arboretum. And yes, we have to, you said we do different strategies for different areas. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So in terms of strategies, thinking about where leaves will blow is an aspect of that. So, if we have a walkway or there's a road right nearby, we may be more likely to mulch the leaves right on that margin next to the road to prevent that. That being said, when you mulch leaves, it really decreases the amount of leaves blowing around. Those finer pieces, they settle into the lawn, and once it rains a few times, they'll really just stay in place. So the mulching can help with reducing blowing around by a lot.
Can a too thick layer of leaves inhibit perennials from growing up in the spring?
Yeah, that's another really good question. So that is something to think about. If you're growing native plants, if you go out into the woods, our native plants have no problem shooting right up through a leaf cover, and a lot of non-native plants will have no problem with that too. If you're concerned about that, you can kind of push leaves away from the bases of plants to help them pop through. And you can also just do a very light layer of leaves on top of plants that you're worried about, or you could just put mulched leaves and not whole leaves, and that will mulched leaves, I think there's almost no concern as long as there's not a huge, multi-inch pile. I don't think mulched leaves would be an issue at all. Whole leaves, if you're concerned, maybe either push them away or think about mulching.
Can you talk about gas-powered mowers and blowers versus electric or battery operated? What's the Arboretum using now? Raking versus blowing, that type of thing.
Yeah, so at the Arboretum, the majority of our blowers are gas powered. And that being said, though, I think for a homeowner use, you could easily go with the battery powered and you're going to get everything you need out of that. Part of the reason we have gas powered blowers is the ones that we have are still in great condition. So we're continuing to use those. And, you know, as the technology gets better and better, there becomes better replacements with battery powered equipment for gas powered equipment. And with certain things like blowers, and there may not be that replacement that's quite there yet in terms of the power we're looking for in a larger landscape. But for people managing their own for their own homes that are interested in battery powered tools, I think you can really get pretty much everything battery powered and it will do what you need it to do.
Great. I think people have concerns about noise and air pollution with the blowers.
Totally.
I think it's a choice that has to be made based on the size of your landscape, as you said. It is annoying to hear blowers all fall, all spring.
Another great reason to leave when you can, you know, less fossil fuel use with equipment like blowers and less nuisance in terms of the noise and things like that.
Right. I loved hearing the statistic that we only collect 7% of the leaves in the Arboretum.
Yeah, and it includes things like, you know, that includes our gates and roads too. So if you're looking at our actual landscape, pretty much the vast majority of leaves are staying in the landscape.
Which is great. Okay, you mentioned that conifers drop needles every few years. I've got a few cryptomeria that drop branches of brown needles. I assume that's normal too.
Totally, yeah, cryptomeria. And by every few years, to clarify that, conifers that drop needles, which all conifers do to some degree, that happens every year. What I meant by that, for example, with the pines, when new needles are produced, they last about 3 or 4 years. So every year, needles are dropping, but the lifespan of the needles themselves on the tree is about 3 or 4 years, if that makes sense. But yeah, cryptomeria, every year you'll see a carpet of brown needles with those in particular too. So that's not a cause for concern.
So here's an interesting question. Would you have been describing the same practices being used 20, 50, or 100 years ago?
Yeah, I think things have totally changed. I think that graph that from the EPA sums it up nicely to a certain degree, that no municipalities were composting leaves, that they were just going straight to the landfill, is kind of interesting to think about that now that we do compost so many leaves. And I think here at the Arboretum, just talking to coworkers that have been here a longer time, every year we are collecting less and less leaves with the leaf vacuum. We're leaving more and more out in the landscape. And as gardening as a whole becomes more ecologically focused, thinking about the impacts of how we manage our gardens, the impact that has on the other living things in the landscape, you know, leaving leaves is one of those things that is becoming more and more popular as time goes on. That being said, if you look at that graph, there's still over 10,000 tons of leaves being sent to the landfill every year from municipalities. So there's still lots of work to do.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think it's also difficult to answer 100 years ago. The landscape was being used so differently.
Totally, right. That history, a lot of
interesting to think about what was happening in Boston 100 years ago with regard to leaves in areas that had trees. Here's someone commenting that oaks and beeches not dropping their leaves may be a protective mechanism, and that if you go into the woods and deer are present, you'll see that they stay away from beeches and oaks because of the wind. So that keeps them from feeding on the trees.
Oh,
I don't know.
The case.
That may be the case.
And I think talking with other people, and I now that that's being mentioned, I believe I've heard that before. And I think part of it is just a mystery too. They're trying to figure out exactly why some leaves hold on to their leaves longer, or some trees hold on to their leaves longer. What's the evolutionary benefit, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. When you are composting leaves, should you be turning it, aerating, if you can?
That will definitely quicken the process. definitely that is a good thing to do. It helps regulate the temperature. That being said, you can just leave leaves as well, and they'll compost over time. But if you want to speed up the process and kind of regulate the temperature of it, that's a good thing to do.
How do leaves prevent compaction?
So anything that can cover the soil and protect it from just being bare is something that is protecting it from footsteps or other objects on top of the soil. Bare exposed soil, especially when wet, is the easiest way to compact soils. And you know that if you've ever walked out on bare soil when it's after a rainstorm, your footstep goes right in. And having a cover, they call it a duff layer in the woods. It's a cover of leaves, it's a spongy thing that lessens the impact of steps and things like that, and prevents compaction through that.
Someone is asking about removing acorns from leaves that are to be mulched. She had a huge grove of seedlings when she left her acorns in the leaves. Is that an issue of not letting it heat up enough and break those acorns down?
Yeah, sure. So with things like acorns, that is tough in a home compost pile. Really, with a lot of home composting, it's very, very difficult to get the proper degree of heat for that breakdown process to kill seeds and diseases and things like that. In bigger compost piles, it's where there's a lot more volume to the pile. It's easier to get that internal temperature that's necessary for things like that. So that can be an issue with home compost piles. That's a little bit hard to work around, if that makes sense.
Someone is asking about palm fronds for compost potential. Know anything about palm fronds?
But I'm totally out of my wheelhouse, but most green material, as long as it's not an invasive or disease issue, which, if palms are from the area, or even not, I don't think that would be so much an issue. That's probably a great ingredient in compost.
Here's another question about the campus leaf collection. How often do you collect leaves, trying to avoid the constant leaf blower issue? And I think you addressed that with mowing. That's no quieter, but I'm not sure what the solution is there.
No, it's a good point. And it kind of depends on the standard of maintenance that's required, if that makes sense. But leaves being left on lawns for several weeks is certainly not going to be a bad thing. So if you want to kind of split up the time in between blowing so that you're not doing it all the time, that shouldn't be an issue. The only thing to consider is if you're mulching regularly and you don't want a thick mulch layer, you want a nice fine mulch layer, it is important to mulch frequently so you're not dealing with huge piles, especially if you don't have a commercial mower, if that makes sense.
Okay. If you don't own a mulching mower, but a man-powered push mower, how much longer would it take for unmulched leaves to break down to be put into the landscape?
Yeah, I think it probably depends on how good that non-motorized mower is and how sharp it is. It's certainly probably going to be a much more difficult process, unfortunately, than a motorized mower. But not to say that couldn't be done. I'm sure it could be.
This is probably one of our last questions. I've heard that mulched leaves acidify the soil and that the tree has already extracted a lot of the nutrient value. So is it possible that leaves aren't that valuable?
Interesting. No, certainly an interesting question, especially when you're considering that a lot of the nutrients that the tree is collecting to make those leaves are then just are going into the leaf and then falling right back to the soil where the tree is collecting those nutrients from. And I think in some ways it's just thinking about the subtraction, even if not thinking about the addition, if that makes sense. So if you continually remove leaves, you're getting rid of that source of nutrients that the tree extracted from to begin with. So it can definitely be a losing proposition at the very least if you're not leaving leaves in your landscape. You're continually taking away that organic matter that the tree is collecting from.
Mm-hmm. I think look at the forest and see all those leaves drop. They refuel the soil there. So
As much as possible, in sustainable minded gardening and leaf management, you want to keep a closed loop. So those leaves are from your landscape. You want to try to keep them in your landscape, if that makes sense.
One last question, and we're going to close it out after that. Do you have a suggestion for raising the temperature in your home compost? Are there additives you can use or techniques?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm not a compost expert, so I don't have probably the best answer for that. I think a larger pile can help with that. Turning more frequently can help with getting the aeration necessary for the proper temperature. Yeah, those are a few things. But like I said, without a really large pile, that is difficult in a homeowner situation. It can be difficult to get the necessary temperatures.
I think if people want to go to our website and search on Arnoldia, I believe that there's an article there about abscission layers, so you could read more about that. And I think we've done a couple articles on composting, so you might find more information there.
And I don't want to dissuade people, because you can make great compost with not hitting those temperatures. It's just a different process.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you for pulling together a PowerPoint, sharing what you know, and I hope people will either start composting or continue composting and maybe improve their efforts through what they've learned from you.
Thanks, Pam, and thanks everyone for joining.
All right. Take care, everybody.